Hello, I'm Eric Schoenberg. I'm the former editor of Inc. and now the brand's CEO. It's hard to imagine any entrepreneur who better deserves a place on Inc.'s Business Hall of Fame than Danny Meyer. Congratulations for that, Danny, and thank you for being part of the Inc. 5000 Vision Conference. We're delighted that you're here.
I'm incredibly happy to be with you, Eric, and thank you very, very much.
Let's talk about the problems that are happening right now around us. No industry has been harder hit by the pandemic than the restaurant industry. How has the portfolio of brands that are run by USHG handled the crisis?
Well, I want to just take a little difference with what you said. I think that there's a lot of industries that have been hit incredibly hard. I wouldn't want to be running an airline right now. I wouldn't want to be running a hotel company right now. I think that businesses that rely upon bringing people together, which is such a crucial part of not only our economy, but also the emotional fabric of society, people being with people, have all been hit really, really hard. If you're in the full service restaurant business, which we are, and you do that in large part in Manhattan, it's been particularly challenging for sure. We were hit first and worst with the virus. And I think that for good reason, our public officials shut things down pretty dramatically. And our city has really responded incredibly well from a health standpoint, which makes me feel really, really good. Sadly, however, a city that is lived in by people who love being with people, or they wouldn't live in New York, and a city whose offices are sadly largely empty right now, doesn't feel like the city that it was and, of course, once again will be. So what we're doing right now is trying to take stock of all the different things that we cannot change and trying to take stock of the things that we can impact and really, really lean into the latter. And I would say that the biggest thing we're trying to lean into is our culture of enlightened hospitality, our purpose, why we're here in the first place. Because if we're going to be sad about not having as much business, or we're going to be sad about the threats to our business, we better be really championing of the reasons we got into this business in the first place. And so that's probably the biggest thing we're thinking about now.
Okay, great, thanks. Lately, you've been vocal about Washington's failure to provide a second round of stimulus, and a round of stimulus, of course, would benefit many small businesses, not just those in the restaurant industry. What would you like to see happen?
Well, if I could wave a magic wand, I would love to see a scenario that looked something like this. That I got a message back in March that it would be the best thing for the people who work in our company and the best thing for our community if we were to close our restaurants, because it might be dangerous to be in business in the restaurant business. And I got that message in March, but accompanying that message, I got another message from policymakers. And what that message would sound like would be, and we're going to ask you to stay closed with no revenue for as long as it takes to get this pandemic completely under control. And when we say it's safe to get back into business, you will have lost and sacrificed 100% of the profits you would have earned during that period of time, but your balance sheet and your solvency will be exactly the same. You will not owe months and months and months of back rent without revenues to pay for it. You won't owe months and months of back accounts payable with no revenues to show for it. You will not have had to lay off people, because we will make you whole so that you can employ and or reemploy the people who couldn't work during that time. And what that would look like would probably cost a lot less than some of the measures we're taking right now.
Wow, that's quite a vision. It really shows the depth of risk that entrepreneurs embrace when they set out on their own. And risk is something that you've been familiar with throughout your entrepreneurial career and even before it started, since your father was an entrepreneur. What was it like growing up in a family headed by an entrepreneur, and how did that affect the way you approached starting your first business, Union Square Cafe?
Well, it's a big four-letter word. It's, on one hand, it's exciting. It's exciting to bet on yourself. It's exciting to have an idea that you believe in so much and you believe that others will benefit from so much that you're willing to put your own money in the game and your own reputation and your own time. The biggest risk of all, I think, is for the people who sign up to work for you, because as a leader, what you're risking is your own credibility. You're basically saying, I see a place we could all go together, and if we go there, things are going to be really good. And I want you to take the risk to stop whatever else you were doing in your life, even if it was unemployment at that time, but I want you to stop anything else you were doing and come join me on this journey. There's risk involved with that. It's a risk on both sides, because I'm also taking a risk that you're someone who's going to make that journey even more valuable for everybody else who's along for the ride. So there's risk in every form. It's financial, it's personal, it's philosophical, but at the end of the day, it's every time we get out of bed, we're taking a risk. We take risks all day that we don't consciously calculate, but each time it's a cost-benefit risk. And we basically say, is it worth taking this risk for the potential benefit that I may gain? And I will say that I've always looked at the upside of profitability last. I believe that profitability ensues when the risks you take succeed in terms of having solved a problem that people actually had. And I love that. Now, having grown up in a family with a dad who was an entrepreneur, I saw how much fun he had dreaming a good dream. I saw how much fun he had coming up with an idea, sometimes crazy ideas that I never would have thought of in a million years. What I also saw, sadly, on the other side, was that he didn't often enough back up his risk-taking by surrounding himself with the kind of talent on his team to compensate for his own weaknesses. And so a lot of my risk-taking throughout my entire career has actually consciously been thinking about that point and making sure to check in with myself about my liabilities, my deficiencies, my weaknesses, try to play to my strengths, but try to hire as many people as I possibly can who know how to do things I only wish I could do.
When you first set out on that journey, the journey led you to the food industry. Why that? Did you know anything about it before you started?
Well, I think I was getting an education in food for my entire life, and that gets me back to both my mom and my dad. It turns out that for the first 2 years of their marriage, my dad was stationed in a small town in France. He was a counterintelligence agent in the U.S. Army. And they lucked into not only being in one of the most beautiful parts of France on the border of Germany and France, Alsace-Lorraine, but they were there at a time when there just weren't that many altercations. And so they had nothing but time on their hands, and they spent a good amount of their time driving to small inns throughout France, getting to know the owners and the family members of these small inns, eating their way through some of the best food regions and wine regions in the world. And my dad came back to the United States after that and founded a business called Open Road Tours, in which he designed driving tours for Americans who had largely not explored that part of the world back in the early 1960s. And that then became an organization called Relais de Campagne, which later became Relais and Chateau. And my dad became the first American agent for the Relais and Chateau. So I'm telling you that story because in order to run his business, he would have the sons and daughters of these innkeepers living in our home in St. Louis, along with my brother and sister and our little dog named Ratatouille. And we always had a bottle of Beaujolais on the table every night. There was always good food being cooked. And so without even knowing it, I was getting this amazing education in food. And by the way, let me also add that in the background, the only TV we were allowed to have on at the dinner table was if Julia Child was on TV. So getting cooking lessons out of this eye, getting French lessons out of these ears, and certainly getting to eat some good food along the way.
That's a great story. It's funny looking back, hard to imagine, in fact, considering the success you've had, that one of the very first big reviews that you got at Union Square Cafe was scathing. How did that make you feel, and how did you react to it?
Well, I wish I could say we've only had one scathing review in all these years, but I do remember what I think was the first one. It was from a restaurant newsletter writer named Seymour Britschke, if I'm not mistaken. And now that you asked the question, I'm remembering almost every single word in there because it stung. It stung in a big way. And he wrote, "The blazer-clad, curly-headed owner can't keep his hands out of his hair," which is probably a good thing because at least we know he never goes anywhere near the kitchen. But while we're on the topic of the awful food, and the thing just got worse and worse and worse from there. And I was so hurt by that review that I must have mentioned it to another young restaurateur at the time named Drew Nieporent, who went on to become quite a famous restaurateur. And he said, "Oh, that guy's he's the hardest critic in the world. You know where to find him, don't you?" And I said, "Where?" And he told me the name of a jazz club, which is now out of business, called Bradley's. And Drew said after he has his restaurant's meals that he's reviewing, he always goes to have a cocktail and listen to jazz at Bradley's every single night. So I took my then girlfriend, now my wife of 32 years, to Bradley's one night, and there he was. And I had with me 3 magazines, each one of which had the little white subscription address tag on it with my name on it. And I positioned those 3 magazines on the side of the table sitting right next to him. And my wife, my then girlfriend, Audrey, said, "You got to be out of your mind. He's going to see who you are." And I said, "That's exactly the point. I want to have a conversation with him." And I never did have a conversation, but we started talking about how great Union Square Cafe was within his earshot while he was trying to listen to jazz. I just wanted to get in his face. Did it do me any good? Sort of, because I then wrote him a letter and I said, "I want to thank you above all for having been the first person to take an interest in my new restaurant. We have a 20-year lease. And I promise you that, like a good red wine, we will improve with age. And I really hope you'll have the opportunity to stop by again and watch that happen." Well, sure enough, about 3 months later, he returned and he elevated our dot, which is, it's one less than no stars. A dot, no star. He lifted that all the way up to 1 star. And boy, I don't think I've ever been happier with a 1-star review in my life.
In those early years, were you ever scared? It took you famously 9 years to open the next restaurant, the Gramercy Tavern.
Oh, I was scared a lot. I mean, there were moments that could have put me out of business. Like 2 months after opening Union Square Cafe, we still didn't have enough business to fill our second dining room. And a friend of mine was in town for Christmas vacation. And I took him up to the balcony overlooking a dining room that for the first time ever had 2 people dining in it. And just as I'm showing him that dining room, I'm gesturing with my hand, and the entire track lighting from 30 feet up swung down like a guillotine and knocked a 3-inch gash in the wall about 5 inches from the head of the person who was our very first ever diner in that dining room. 5 inches are the difference between me speaking to you right now and serving time somewhere else. Was I scared? Yes. I've been scared on many, many occasions. We've had fires. We've had floods in our basements where the water comes up to your knees. You know, we've gone through all kinds of adversity, just like so many other people do. 9/11 was an incredibly scary time in New York City. And the thing I can say about all of those events, and whatever the fears have been, it's what we do that has gotten us through it. It's what we do by bringing people together. Bringing people together who all they want is to belong to something. Our employees want to belong to the place they work. Our guests want to belong and feel like they belong to the place they go out to eat. And the hardest thing about the pandemic is that the very thing we do at our best, bringing people together, is the very thing we're not permitted to do. And even in that, we're looking for entrepreneurial solutions, which is why as soon as it became safe enough to bring people back to work in the food industry, we came up with every safety protocol we possibly could with lots and lots of consultation. We asked each one of our restaurants to figure out what can they do that brings people hospitality, even if we cannot bring people into our restaurants. And some of them came up with ideas like turning their restaurant into a wine store. One of them turned their restaurant into basically a grocery meal kit kind of store. They all figured out ways to have their food delivered, sometimes delivered across the country via a company called Goldbelly. They all figured out ways to have QR codes for ordering so nobody would have to touch a menu and you could have food delivered to your home. Then all of a sudden we were able to get sidewalk dining. Then all of a sudden we were able to get 25% capacity dining indoors. And at each step of the way, we've just had to figure out, how do we make this work? It's not profitable business right now, but we believe we have to be the change we want to see. And so if we want to see this city start to look and feel and smell and taste like the New York City that attracted all of us, we got to get out there and be part of what makes that happen.
That's fantastic and so entrepreneurial. And yeah, I think you have to get that feeling when you walk the New York City streets these days and see all the outside cafes. This does not look like a defeated place at all. And restaurants do not look like a defeated industry. I want to talk about the philosophy that you've brought to Union Square and has expanded well beyond the confines of your company and the industry in general, and it has to do with flipping on its head the usual priority of stakeholders that every entrepreneur has. The tradition is that the investor comes first, the old Milton Friedman equation. You've tilted that on its head and put your employees first and investors last. Why?
Well, I think it's common sense. I think that it took me a while to figure this out. I took exactly one economics course in college, and yeah, we read Milton Friedman and learned all about the primacy of the investor and making every decision in service of the investor. And I grew up in a family with, half the family was from Chicago, half the family from St. Louis, and all I ever heard about growing up was service, 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 take care of the customer first. And both of those rang sort of true to me, but what I realized is that we were doing it a little bit differently. And it's not because I was actually consciously trying to reject what I had heard. I was just intuitively trying to do what felt best to me, largely based on some insecurities. Keep in mind, when I opened Union Square Cafe, I was 27 years old. At least half the people who worked for me were older than I was. The first time I was ever anybody's boss was at the age of 22, and I was running the field operations for Cook County for a presidential candidate named John Anderson, who was running as the independent candidate against Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. And 100% of the 30 people who reported to me were volunteers. And so my two first experiences as a boss, in one case, half the people were older than me, and I went to work as many young bosses do, more concerned about them liking me than respecting me. In the other case, where 30 people were volunteers, I didn't have a paycheck to offer them. I couldn't give anybody a bonus, couldn't give anyone a raise, couldn't dock anyone their pay for not showing up. So the only currency I had in that case was the currency of working together for a higher purpose. And so if you combine those two things together, what was intuitively driving my way of doing business was to say this: we will never do better with our customers than the employee experience of working together feels to them. And I knew that if I could invert this, and I hadn't read Robert Greenleaf's Servant Leadership at this point, but that's something that people had studied long before I did. I don't take any credit for this. But the notion of inverting the classic org structure to say, I go to work for the purpose of serving the people who I am now expecting to serve our guests, our customers, so that we can have more revenue. And then you start thinking about, how does this virtuous cycle of stakeholders work? And you say, every business in the world, every organization in the world actually has the exact same 5 stakeholders, right? You got employees and customers. You do business within a community. You have suppliers from whom you depend on the highest quality products. And you have investors who took a risk on you in the hopes that they would make a healthy return. But guess what? If they do make that return, what do they want to do? They want to reinvest because they want more. And every time they reinvest, your employees can benefit by getting professional and financial wins out of the game. So that was when I started to see this virtuous cycle where one good thing could keep leading to something even better. Do I want to make a profit? Absolutely. But I've always viewed profitability as the fuel, as the outcome that drives the car. It's not the destination. It's the fuel without which we cannot get to the destination. But the real destination has to be our purpose. Why do we exist in the first place? And as a leader, I feel like my biggest job is to get the right people on this team who say, I hear the vision, I like where we're going, I want to help you get there. And in return for that, I'm going to do great things for our customers, and our customers are going to go out proclaiming how much they love doing business with us. Our communities are going to be thrilled when they hear we're opening a restaurant next door to their apartment or a half a block from their office. And then that's going to give us even more money with which to work with even better suppliers and get better products, which once again fuels this virtuous cycle.
I love that, Danny. The profits are the fuel, the mission, the purpose is the destination. Now, you can't put your employees first unless you hire well. What are the characteristics you look for when you're interviewing job candidates?
You know, employees are to a work culture what grapes are for a winemaker. And it's not that I walk around looking at my employees as if they're grapes, but you cannot make a better wine than the quality of the grapes that went into it. And I'd take it a step further on this metaphor because I love wine. And not only do you need to select the best grapes, but you have to select the right grapes for the soil and the terroir where you're growing those grapes. There's a reason that in Burgundy they knew that Pinot Noir would grow incredibly well there, or in Bordeaux they knew that Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot would grow incredibly well. Whereas not that many miles away in the Rhone Valley, they knew that Syrah would grow incredibly well. Well, not every employee is going to grow incredibly well in our soil. Our soil is our culture. And so the things that we think about are, did we pick the right grapes for this soil? Like a great winemaker, did we train the grapes properly? You go to any vineyard and you're going to see that the grapevines are actually trained. You're going to see that they're pruned so that the sun gets to the healthy ones and they get rid of the unhealthy ones. because they're sapping the energy and nutrients from the healthy ones. And that's why, sadly, but importantly, sometimes we need to exit the wrong people, the wrong grapes from this team. And the climate, yeah, we could use some sunshine. We could use a few long days in the summertime and not too much rain during harvest season. That's like the economy. You know, a lot of the grape grower cannot impact what's happening with the climate, and we cannot impact what's happening with the economy as a whole. But even in a bad vintage, the best winemakers always make the best wine. And they make the best wine because they selected and trained better than anybody else. Now, what we look for very specifically in our grapes, our employees, are people who have a very high level of 6 different emotional skills. And you know, some people call this EQ, emotional quotient. We actually call it HQ, hospitality quotient. Because what we're looking for is somebody who, apart from what they're really, really good at doing, whether you're a really good grill cook or a good pasta maker or a good reservationist or a good sommelier, apart from that thing you do really well, we're looking for people who have a high HQ, and that's somebody who is happier themselves when they make other people feel better. Now, that's an emotional skill, and I don't go around the world judging people based on their HQ any more than I would go around the world judging people on their IQ. You know, as far as I'm concerned, if I were judged on my IQ, I probably wouldn't pass too many tests. But like an IQ, you cannot teach HQ. It's something that people are naturally wired with or not, and it's, in our judgment, made up of 6 different emotional skills that, when they come together at a pretty high level, usually lead to someone with a high HQ. That's who we want on our team. And I'll tell you what they are. The first one is optimistic kindness. The second one is intellectual curiosity. The third one is work ethic. The fourth is empathy. The fifth is self-awareness. And the sixth is integrity. Now you may say, great, those are nice words. What the heck does that have to do with how delicious my pasta is at night? And I would argue that it has everything to do with how delicious your pasta is, because your pasta will have been cooked by and served by somebody who is either going through the motions or actually investing all those things into it in the service of wanting you to be happier than you were before you got to taste that pasta. I want someone who's kind. I'm working long hours. I don't want to work with someone who's not kind. I want someone who's optimistic. I don't want to work with skeptics who say, yeah, we could try it, but it'll never work. I want someone who says, let's go for it, which, by the way, is a pretty important entrepreneurial skill as well. I want someone who is curious, who doesn't believe they're a finished product, who looks at every day as an opportunity to learn something new and contribute something new. Yeah, and I want someone who's got a great work ethic. I can teach anybody how to set the table, but I cannot teach you to care about doing it as well as it can be done. And how about empathy? It's a big word, it's an easy word, but I want someone who is aware of how their behavior impacts your feelings. And finally, yeah, I want someone who is self-aware, who knows what their own personal weather report is. Hospitality in any organization is a team sport. And if I woke up on the wrong side of the bed today and I bring that to you, we call that skunking. And that's going to bring down the performance of the rest of the team. On the other hand, if I wake up feeling energetic and I share that, it's going to probably lift the rest of the team. Now, we don't expect anybody any more than we expect the weather report climate-wise to be the same every day. We don't expect any of us to wake up feeling 72 degrees and sunny with no humidity every day of our lives. But we do expect people to be self-aware enough to know what their own weather report is and to go do something about it in the service of the entire team. And finally, integrity. Integrity is having the judgment to do the right thing even when it may not be in your own self-interest and even when no one else is looking. So now you show me 5 really, really good pasta cooks, and I'm going to taste their pasta. I actually think I can taste those 6 emotional skills in the pasta. I think I can taste if somebody cares and put all that love and concern into the very food that they cook, and certainly into the food that they serve me when I'm at the table.
That's fantastic. Danny, you sound so passionate about your employees. It's clear how that contributed to your success. But now I want to talk about you. When you first started, you committed yourself 24/7 to the restaurants. And now that you have so many properties in your portfolio, that's not possible. This is a tough transition for a lot of entrepreneurs, to entrust your baby to the executives you've hired. How was that for you, and how have you managed to make that transition?
Well, it was really tough for me, especially at the outset. And when I say the outset, I would say that it took me probably the first 15 years of my career to accept that I was the CEO of a restaurant company when my entire identity had been completely tied up in being a restaurateur. And, you know, if I'm filling out a occupation form on some website, I'll still say restaurateur because that's what I think I am, and I think that's what I do. But it was an important moment to accept that I was the CEO of a restaurant company. And what I would say to any entrepreneur is that our license to grow is our ability to allow other people to grow. And the way that that happens, and by the way, there's no law that says anyone needs to grow. You can come up with an idea for a groundbreaking kind of hardware store and have one of them for 30 years and be very, very happy. But if you do want to grow, your license to do so is to permit others to grow. And what you do is the same thing you would do if you were a gardener, which is you've got to sweep through the garden every single day and ask yourself, what are all the things that I've always done, but guess what? Now there are other people who could do those things as well or better than I ever did them. And you have to have the confidence that every time you do that and you give one of those flowers or vegetables to someone else, that there's another piece of the garden that you can still do as well or better than anyone else in the organization. And increasingly as the years go by, it stops being as many of the things you used to do and starts being more of the things that you see, more of the things that you feel, more of the things that you intuit. A lot more of my time these days is spent thinking about our culture and how do we want to be intentional about who we are, how we behave, how we show up in the world as a business. Does that mean I don't care deeply about talking to chefs about recipes and you know what the artwork looks like in the restaurant and what kind of tables we selected and what kind of masks our waiters are wearing? No, I care about all those details as much as I've ever cared about them. But there's a whole lot of other people who can do that as well or better than I do. And so the opportunity for me to grow is to keep culling through the garden. And when I say giving things up, I don't mean giving up caring about them. I mean giving up the responsibility for doing those things to other people while I take on more things that I think I'm better suited for.
So Danny, what's the most satisfying part of the job now?
The most satisfying part of the job right now is exactly the most satisfying part about being a dad and being a husband. And that's when your kids are really getting along well. They are becoming more and more independent. They are teaching me things when I used to think it was my job to teach them things. And everybody is retaining their own identity and their own special personality and gifts in life, and yet they're playing in harmony. And I absolutely love that, because I realized that at the end of the day, it's kind of like when I was a kid and I'd go out and play a game of pickup baseball with our neighbors, or football or whatever, and you really, the most impactful thing you can do is, as a captain, is pick the better team than the other guy picked. And then the next most impactful thing you can do is call better plays. And if you got better players on your team and you're calling better plays, it's going to feel really fun, because you're going to probably win a hell of a lot of those games.
Yeah, yeah. One of the other participants in the Inc. 5000 Vision Conference is the founder of Momofuku, David Chang. And he says that the restaurant industry is going to have to change to emerge stronger on the other side of the pandemic. What industry weaknesses do you believe were revealed by the pandemic?
Well, I think David Chang is absolutely right about that. And one of my colleagues said something that has really stuck with me. And he said, our industry going into COVID is like a really elderly person going into COVID with a pre-existing condition. And they may have been done in without COVID, but COVID certainly was going to be the thing that was going to put them over the edge. So in our industry's case, in the full service part of our business, which is what I'm talking about here in New York, I'm not talking about the Shake Shacks of the world, the fine casual, fast casual side, but in the full service sector, every year for the past 15 years, our margins have narrowed and narrowed and narrowed and narrowed, while the people who work in our business have been making less and less money when you adjust it for inflation. That's not a sustainable model. It's not a sustainable model to have a business that exists for the purpose of making people feel better, and the business itself is threatened, and the people who work in the business are no longer being compensated for the extraordinary work that they put into it and the number of hours that they put into it. Now, let's face it, no one ever got into this business in the first place because it was easy. We all got into this business as entrepreneurs because we thought we had a fresh way of making people feel better. And one of the tough things about the pandemic is that we're all working a lot harder, but we're not correspondingly getting the joy out of taking care of as many people. And so when you look at the pre-existing conditions, I would have to start with the compensation model in our industry. Unwittingly, the compensation model where half of a restaurant's staff is tipped and half of the staff is paid by the restaurant, and every time menu prices go up, they go up as a result of higher real estate costs, they go up as a result of higher labor costs, they go up as a result of higher food and beverage costs. And every time the menu price goes up, the tipped employees make more money. But because of margin compression, the non-tip eligible employees, which you should know are people who work in the kitchen, either stay stagnant or may even go down. And it is a completely wrong-headed way to do business. And unwittingly, our industry, which has done so much for so many people, we are a more successful first-time employer than any other industry in the country. We hire people who have newly come to our country. We hire people who don't necessarily have the greatest job skills other than a heart for hospitality and a work ethic. And I'm really, really proud of that. What I'm not proud of is that as successful as we've been at teaching America to pay a little bit more for organic or responsibly grown vegetables, to pay a little bit more for animals that were raised the right way. We have yet to succeed at teaching America to pay more for people. And What would you say about an industry that exists for the purpose of making people feel better, but unwittingly whose compensation structure is actually fueling the opposite? Sometimes fueling sexism, sometimes fueling racism, sometimes fueling a lack of dignity for people. I think a lot of people probably don't know that tipped employees make on average 2 to 3 times as much money as non-tipped employees. They may also not know that tipped employees in the dining room are 60% white, and non-tip eligible people in the kitchen are 70% people of color. So what that means is every time we go to a restaurant, we didn't do anything wrong, it's just the system, but we're actually fueling something we don't want to fuel. And I think one of the really important lessons of this pandemic period, when we've not been able to be in business as usual, is to think about who do we want to be when it's over. And I know that our industry can actually lead the way amongst all industries about getting this right.
Your investment fund is called Enlightened Hospitality Investors. Some of the companies in your portfolio include Diggin, Joe Coffee, Goldbelly, which you mentioned earlier, as a company that ships fine food from restaurants in one town, maybe all the way across the country. What are you most excited about now with your investment fund?
Well, our investment fund, Enlightened Hospitality Investments, exists because I wanted to acknowledge 2 things. I wanted to acknowledge that there's not enough hours in the day for us to conceive and execute and scale as many business ideas as I would like to. And so we said, what if we could actually do 2 things at the same time? What if we could advance our culture of enlightened hospitality by placing bets on other entrepreneurs outside of our company who came up with an idea we only wish we had come up with, who are the kind of people we only wish we could have hired as leaders? And what if we could actually provide growth funding to help those businesses scale not just what they do, but how they do it? And that was how we conceived EHI, Enlightened Hospitality Investments. And we've had the best time looking for these kind of businesses, and we've now made 9 investments. And so far, so good. And what we're really trying to prove to ourselves and to the people who work at Union Square Hospitality Group is we believe in an enlightened hospitality so much that we're willing to bet on other people who are doing it. We don't have a monopoly on it. We don't have a monopoly on great ideas, and we certainly don't have enough time. But every time we see one of their businesses do well, Salt and Straw Ice Cream, Madison Reed, which is a do-it-yourself hair coloring company, but fueled by hospitality. Every time we see one of those businesses do well, it reinforces for our team here that what we say is what we mean.
The audience here at the Inc. 5000 Vision Conference is made up of entrepreneurs. Some of them are early in their growth trajectory, and some are at that inflection point where they've been growing very rapidly and are trying to figure out a way to sustain that. If you had one piece of advice for people at that inflection point, those fast-growing entrepreneurs, what would it be?
Stay the course and realize that the course is never a straight line. It's a lot like sailing in a regatta. You can see the island that you're pointing for, but in the history of the world, there's never been a regatta that was a straight line. You've got to react to the conditions. You got to pivot when it calls for pivoting. You got to always improve the talent on your team. And that means losing people who are not contributing to winning and picking up people who can help do things that you only wished you could do. And that's the hardest part about the whole journey, because if you're in the business of servant leadership, which is serving the rest of your team, and by the way, that's another apt metaphor for being the skipper of a boat. If you're the skipper of the boat, you're in the back of the boat. And yeah, you got to pick the boat, and yeah, you got to pick the destination, and yep, you get to be the ultimate steerer, but you can't do any of it without getting lots and lots of input and assistance from people who see the conditions way in front of the boat, way before you ever did. And so you better make sure that those people want to go where you're going, are happy to be on that boat, and are looking out for your interests, because you're the guy in the back, and it's going to be a pretty mean crash if you don't get this right.
Great. Danny Meyer, thank you so much for this. That advice is great. And a wonderful motto for great leaders is that it's not about you, it's about the people to help you get where you want to go. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric.
Bye-bye.